Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the British School at Rome. I'm Steve Milner, I'm the director, and it is my pleasure, with a capital P, to welcome back, after I'm sure we'll be told how long it was, quite a while, Andrew Hopkins, former assistant director at the British School at Rome, under the reign, is that the right word, of Andrew Wallace-Hadrill. It's fantastic and typically provocative, as we can see from the title. One of the buildings that's often held up as being the most perfect architectural building of its type, with the title Neither Perfect Nor Ideal, gives us some idea of the point of departure for what promises to be an incredibly stimulating talk. Andrew's currently Professore Associato, a faculty member at the University of L'Aquila, one of the few non-Italians to manage to secure a job in the Italian university sector, which I always feel deserves a hearty congratulation. A BA, sorry, that's what caused the earthquake, seismic ripples. A BA from the University of Melbourne and a PhD at the Courtyard Institute, awarded in 1995. He's been the recipient of multiple awards, has had a fellowship at the Getty Research Institute in 2013, Paul Mellon Senior Fellow at the National Gallery in Washington, had a fellowship, I think, also over in Villa in Florence, the Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies, and received a distinguished award from the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain in 1996 for his essay on the influence of ducal ceremony on church design in Venice. And it's very much in both in Rome, but also in the Veneto, that Andrew's kind of pursued his research on matters of building and architectural. The list of publications is suitably lengthy, and I'm sure if you pass on and look on academia.edu, you can find them downloadable in PDF format. Roman Bodies, Antiquity to the 18th Century, co-edited with another friend of the BSR, Maria Wyke, which was one of the published by the British School at Rome. Another British School at Rome publication on Lutyens abroad, the work of Sir Edward Lutyens outside the British Isles. Santa Maria della Salute, Architecture and Ceremony in Baroque Venice, and more recently Baldassare Longhena and the Venetian Baroque, with a revised edition in English that came out with the Yale University Press in 2012. So what the Italians call a massima autorità, I think. So it's an absolute delight to welcome him back to the BSR, and I really look forward to this paper, which I'm sure will be both stimulating and entertaining in equal measure. Andrew.
Well, thanks very much to Stephen for that introduction, which I think is very Italian, really, to add a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, but it's okay in this context. It has been 16 years since I spent a night at the British School at Rome, so that's quite something. I have been here in the meantime, but just during the day. And these days, I wouldn't really wear a tie, except this is the one I bought for my going away drinks in 2002, so a little bit of nostalgia. It's still in very good nick. So it's nice to see old friends and faces and new ones. And the talk today is neither perfect nor ideal, as you can see from the title. If a series of documents had been published by the Louvre indicating that a significant proportion of the Mona Lisa had been painted by others 15 years after it had originally been begun by Leonardo, and that these substantial interventions after his death altered in important ways the overall conception of the competition, would curators and art historians simply ignore these documents, or merely cite the article publishing them and more or less ignore the findings, continuing to talk and write about the Mona Lisa as if it was entirely or mostly the work of Leonardo? It is the contention of this paper that the most celebrated building designed by Andrea Palladio, born in 1508 and dying in 1580, known as the Villa Rotonda, and begun around 1567 or 68, but left only partially constructed at the time of the architect's death, with much building taking place between 1592 and 1600, is neither perfect nor ideal. These two qualities might perhaps be said to characterize the celebrated woodcut illustration published by Palladio in his treatise I Quattro Libri di Architettura in 1570, And here you see Inigo Jones's copy, annotated of the 1600 edition that's in Worcester College, Oxford. Lots of annotations on this page. But much of the building was constructed and altered after his death, in significant part to deal with inherent difficulties and deficiencies with the design. The tortuous early construction history appears to have been a frustrating failure for Palladio after 1570, somewhat easier for the patron, Paolo Almerico, from 1580 until his own death in 1589, but a free hand to complete the building only came in 1591 when the brothers Capra, who purchased the incomplete building, had Venetian stonemasons construct the 4 porticos and the 4 external staircases, in effect the image of the building, to a different design from Palladio's. It was only in the 18th century that the villa was Palladiofied based on the treatise illustration, so the power of print. In the mid-19th century, the villa underwent a drastic restoration, and many of the alterations were then only rectified in the 1970s, when the current owners undertook a careful, conservative restoration to preserve the villa for posterity and further Palladioify it. Perhaps Palladio's published design for the rotunda is best understood as a statement of his ideal program. Like his projects for the Rialto Bridge in Venice of the 1550s and 1570s, or his suggestion to demolish the Ducal Palace in Venice after the fire of 1577. And this is not by Palladio, and it's not for the Ducal Palace, but it gives you a sense of what a public building might have been like in those days. He provocatively proposed these projects, but presumably never thought they would be accepted or built. Was the Villa Rotunda perhaps then also initially a playful joke? Palladio appears to take a bold-faced lie when he writes in 1570 that it was almost finished. And look at line 5. Ove ha fatto si ridussi ad un suburbano in monte, and it goes on and on. Ove ha fatto fabbricato secondo l'invenzione che segue, etc., etc. And if we look down here, it's in the past tense, which is interesting. So it's done. Vi sono state fatte le logge in tutte quante le facce, sotto i piani delle quali e delle sale sono le stanze per la comodità e uso della famiglia. So he's saying it's done, but actually the documents prove that that cannot be true. So something's happening. And instead it was only partially constructed, and the question is this why he never designed or built another villa after 1566? It's his last villa. He lives for 14 more years. He's famed as a villa designer. There is not another villa. 5 distinct phases of the construction history of the complex can be identified. When examined separately, it becomes easier to tease out the different aims and achievements of the individuals involved in each phase, which also facilitates attributing intent and authorship. Rather than beginning with the first phase, up until Palladio's publication of the villa in his treatise of 1570, the second phase until the death of Palladio in 1580, or the third phase until the death of the original patron, Paolo Almerico, in 1589, for all of which phases there's a dearth of documents or factual evidence, the most revealing phase to examine at the outset is the fourth, from 1591, when the brothers Gabriel and Odorico Capra purchased the site from Almerico's heirs and introduced, thankfully, a libro spese that provides documentary evidence of the work undertaken on the complex from 1591 till 1619. These documents indicated that it was only after 1591 that much significant work was done on the building that can be said to have given the rotunda the look and form it had until the mid-18th century, when it was reproduced in engravings by Francesco Mutoni, and this is 1740. These are going to shock you. Has anyone seen these before? Some people who work on Palladio in the 18th century will have, but essentially what you're seeing here is that there are cut stairs in the staircase. There are cuts in all 4 of the staircases, something that is not evident today. And This is what the Villa Rotonda looked like from the 1590s until 1760s. It did not look like at all like Palladio had illustrated in his treatise, in the sense that the dome is wrong and there is direct access into the ground floor through the center of the staircases. So something very different from his original design. After examining this period, now, a note on the orientation of the villa is pertinent at the outset, as the documents, sorry for my funny colors, but anyway, the documents refer to the facades. It's very confusing, the Villa Rotonda, when you try and study it, because all the facades look the same, so you never know which one you're looking at, unless you look very carefully. So the other problem is that the documents refer to the facades as facing north, south, east, and west. But this is in fact not true. It's the four corner angles of the villa that face these cardinal points of the compass, rather than the facades. While the corners point in the direction of four important cities for Palladio: east towards Venice, south towards Rome, west towards Verona, and north towards Vicenza. But an analysis of how sunlight falls on the villa throughout the day indicates that the sun sets predominantly on the current entrance facade that you see here, Barchesa and entrance facade, which corresponds with references to west in the documents. To avoid confusion, here the facades will be identified with what they face. Therefore, they are described as the entrance and Barchesa facade, the road and river facade, the fields facade, and the woods facade. In addition, the villa complex as a whole will be referred to as the Villa Rotonda, as distinct from references to the central room on the Piano Nobile from which it takes its name. And that's also something confusing in the documents. When they say La Rotonda, are they talking about the central room or are they talking about the building? It's often very difficult to know. So there's one. So when we look at it from there, for people who've been there, you recognize the Barchesa and the path up to the villa. But if I show you the photo from another side, you'd be very hard pushed to know exactly where you were. But from this side, the fields facade is down here, the woods is over there, entrance and road and river. So it's really, you've got to keep a sort of quite strict watch out on where you are. So what I've done, I've put the plan onto this photograph, just to show you again. So the road over there, the fields down here, the woods which come very close up to the villa, and then the entrance facade over there. So let's start with the fourth phase, which I call fixing the problem, constructing cut external staircases and pedimented porticos. In 1987, in the last issue of the Bollettino of the Palladio Center in Vicenza, Mario Saccardo published an article entitled Il perfezionamento della rotondo promesso da Odorico e Mario Capra. Pursuing an earlier reference to the existence of libro spese for the period indicated, Saccardo identified the document in the Biblioteca Bertoliana, which is a late 17th century transcription of a series of earlier receipts for payments by the Capra brothers. The authenticity of this document is not in doubt. It was checked by the Centro Palladio, although subsequent to its publication, numerous scholars lapidarily dismissed or downplayed its importance, referring to finishing touches and decorative work, which is all this part of the Palladio story, which has to be perfect. So that's part of the problem. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the decade or so following the villa's purchase by the Capras in 1591, an enormous amount of construction work was paid for. And here I'm just going to give you a very quick run through because there's loads of documents. I'm just going to focus on a couple of elements. So instead of doing them year by year, which Saccardo presented, I'm just going to present them by type. Feet of stone. Between 1592 and 1596, 683 feet of stone were built on the external staircases. 683 feet. It's a lot of stone. Stone parapets set on balusters. Between 1592 and 1595, parapets were installed on balusters set around the perimeter of the central openings in at least 3 of the external staircases. These were described by Thomas Courtyard in 1605 and Inigo Jones in 1613 and illustrated by Francesco Mutoni in 1740. 56 balusters were paid for in 1592 and another couple a few years later. So a lot of balusters. Doors and windows. In 1593, 2 large doors connecting the porticos to the interior were constructed, as well as the apertures of the rotonda. And again, this could mean the entrances or exits of the building or of the internal room. 2 further exits were built in 1594 and another 2 in 1595, when it was specified that they had carved tops, and these were the internal staircase access doors giving onto the central rotunda space. No, that's not it. Nor is it there. So these into the staircases you see in the 4 corners. In 1596, a carpenter provided wooden doors for the entrances to the spiral staircases from the central room, as well as 4 doors for 4 cupboards under the stairs, really pragmatic sorts of things. Windows were constructed, 12 windows, others were glazed. Further windows were done in 1595. We even know that in 1596 they were specifying 4 windows per side, probably those of the attic, and even going so far as to specify that they would be made of soft stone to the south and hard stone to the west, presumably to deal with climate and weather conditions. Pavements. Pavements in the red room, the silver room, the Berettina room, and the small room were paved in 1592. In 1593, shavings of coloured marbles and Istrian stone were brought from Venice to mix together for the pavements of the terraces, the portico pavements. And we know that Lunardo paved 2 of the lodges in the central room in 1594. So it's stacks of work. Finally, in 1596, the Barchessa, which you see here, 8 new windows were constructed in it. And you can see them there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is done in 1596. The Canevon, or the cantina, was already in existence, and it's very hard to photograph because it's covered by vegetation. It's here. This was already in existence, but some of the vaulting was falling down, so this was rebuilt. So there's the Barchessa, there's the Canevon. These are built in the 1590s. And we also have a document for 1602 when it says that they're going to get stone for the Strada Grande, the entrance road. Well, in my opinion, the Strada Grande can be nothing else except the road that you see at the top left. That is the road that goes from Venice to Vicenza. It's always been known as the Strada Grande, so we know that, in fact, the walls, li muri lungo la Strada Grande, so that must be 1602. So it's much later than ever thought of before. So to sum up, an honest reading of the documents published can only lead to the conclusion that a very significant amount of construction of the villa complex was undertaken after 1591. And I now want to go on to talk about the changes that were made, and I think that is particularly important. But the most important thing to say is that, you know, all this work that gave the building the image it has today did not exist in 1570 with Palladio's publication of it, and nor did it even exist in 1580 at the time of his death. So Palladio, in fact, never saw his Villa Rotunda as he had designed it and as he'd started to build it. So let's go back to phase 1, mid-1560s, when we think it was firstly designed, 65, 66, and 66, 67, when we think it was actually, the construction was begun. And this phase I call building a Belvedere, as opposed to what it became. So although only meagerly documented, the basic bones of the story of the villa's beginning are found in all the textbooks and scholarship. Paolo Almarico, who had spent much of his career as an ecclesiastic in Rome, wanted to retire and return home to his native Vicenza. Rather than return to the city proper, where he owned a residence, in the mid-60s he sold this in order to purchase this site, where it would become the Villa Rotunda. He briefly returned to Rome, and then a year later returned to Vicenza in 1566, and so The original design might be 1565 or 1566. I don't think it matters that much. Scholars now agree on initial design date then and a presumed construction date 1567, 1568. Now, while some of Palladio's villas were constructed quite rapidly, the Villa Pisani at Montagnana was begun in early 1553 and was habitable by the autumn of 1554, so quick. Not all were. In this instance, however, by 1571, Paolo Almerico was able to write a codicil to his will, to his testament in the Villa Rotonda, probably on the ground floor, mentioning that it now existed. So this document, together with Palladio's illustration of 1570, an accompanying description, suggests that the basic block of the building was well on the way to being finished, and probably indicates at the very least that considerable construction had indeed been undertaken in the 2 to 3 years to 1570. It might be reasonable to, oh yes, that works, good. It might be reasonably supposed that all 3 floors of the central block, so what we're talking about here, had been built: the ground floor, the piano nobile, and the attic. Although there is no evidence, we don't know how finished off it was or not, and there's absolutely no evidence whether the dome was constructed at this time, the controversial dome was constructed by this time or not, although I think that's a bit of a red herring, which we'll talk about beyond this. Given that all Palladio's, oh God, I did the wrong thing. It's okay. There's lots of, you know, the problem, I don't know, I'm 53, you know, the next generation's going to be born with little fingers for all our little devices, but some of us have problems with little devices. It's microscopic. Anyway, we'll keep going. Given that all Palladio's other villas have clearly differentiated front and rear facades, and that these are all clearly oriented towards the main road, Emo, Saraceno, Poiana, towards the main road, Emo, all towards the main road, or towards the river, Pisani at Lonigo, Malcontenta, facing the road, or in the case of the Villa Cornaro, facing the road and facing the canal at the back. It makes me believe that the original and initial front facade of the villa, if we can call it that, you know, is there a front on a building that has 4 sides that are all the same? Well, yes and no, but it's my belief, and this was first suggested by Martin Kubelik in a very interesting article of 1580, and I think it's absolutely plausible. And his datings, all the thermoluminescent datings he did, absolutely stand up, I believe. This was probably the main facade leading from the main road and the river directly up to the villa. This is the most likely and plausible thing to assume. It's facing the Bacchiglione and the road. It's referred to in the documents as the Strada Grande, and of course it brought all travelers from Venice to the east and from Verona to the west. Now, as James Ackerman has, I think you can see it here, and the planting, of course, still exists. So this was probably the main entrance to the Belvedere, and which is the word James Ackerman perceptively pointed out years ago. It describes the building better. It's neither a palace nor a villa, at least at the outset of its planning, conceived for by Palladio. Palladio half-heartedly placed it with his city palaces rather than his villas in his treatise, perhaps also because its form goes against so many of his design principles for villas, developed over more than 2 decades, and that's what I want to talk about now. But just to finish off this, as a belvedere with 4 pedimental porticos, there they are again, from which it was planned to enjoy the view, Palladio's orientation of the building also results in these 4 views being distinctly different. The entrance and Barchessa Loggia enjoys a view that spans from Monte Berico, you see up here, to the city of Vicenza at the right. From the river and the road facade, Loggia 1 can survey everybody traveling to and fro, as well as await any visitors to the villa proceeding up the raised approach. The Fields Loggia faces Almerico's arable land, while the Woods Loggia faces, at surprisingly close distance, a plethora of trees. In 16th century culture that favoured varietas, nothing more could have been desired from each of these loggias in terms of variety for the viewer, a perfect contrast to the 4 identical loggias that were yet to be built. If we move on to the second phase, which I've called a bit silly, no stalle but stalling, architect versus client, question mark. The hitherto unanswered and perhaps unanswerable question remains the same. What happened between 1571 when Almerico signed his codicil in the villa and 1580 when Palladio died? Given the significant gap in time between constructing the main block of the building by around 1570, but only constructing the external staircases and lodges in the 1590s, as shown in the documents, this is a 20-year gap and a change of ownership. The root cause for the apparent lack of progress in the 1570s might be sought by exploring the villa's design, because an analysis of this, in the context of Palladio's other villas, plausibly reveals significant defects in its conception from the outset, something that both the patron, who also seems to have had a change of heart about what he wanted the building to be, presumably came to realize, as well as the architect, and perhaps Palladio wasn't willing to alter his prized published image as he believed it encapsulated so many of his architectural principles. When thinking about the Villa Rotonda in the mid-1560s, Palladio had already designed around 20 villas. He had an immense expertise with this building type. Most of these villas were working farms and were inhabited within a few years of construction beginning. What seems in hindsight extraordinary is that Almerico's villa project is missing so many of a series of advantageous design features that Palladio usually included. To name just the most glaring example, all the other villa designs he did ensured that the ground or semi-basement floor, which was a fundamental area for the kitchen, storage and cellars, was well lit and easily accessible from the outside for the vita di famiglia. By contrast, the Villa Rotonda, despite not being a working farm and therefore without intended agricultural functions, still had to be a working residence with the requirement of a well-illuminated kitchen and other spaces that meant direct access to the ground floor from the exterior was crucial. Yet in this case, Palladio intended only 8 relatively small windows to light the entire ground floor, to which there was no direct access whatsoever from the exterior, meaning that all people and supplies coming in and people and refuse going out would have had to be by way of going up and down the 4 small, very small spiral staircases, which are entered directly and only through the central room, the highlight of the entire villa. You know, it's like, taking the garbage out of the British school through the dining room. Because you have to bring it up from below and come out of one of these, and then you go across there and down the main staircase. All family and staff and supplies for the villa would have had to pass through the central room of the building, whether there were others there or not, a preposterous suggestion in the context of late 16th century hierarchy and etiquette and ceremonial, even in a country villa, especially for a patron who'd spent his career in the hierarchical, etiquette-bound Rome of the papal court. Palladio thereby sacrificed his practical principles in order to create his ideal building, at least on paper. That he fully intended to build such incommodious vertical circulation routes through this building, and not just on paper, is proven by the existence of two of the 4 projected wooden spiral staircases with central newels towards the river and road facade that were described by Inigo Jones in 1613. And one of these, in fact, survives. You can see it. It's a very narrow, very strangely shaped spiral staircase of wood that was rebuilt in the 18th century. And it's very dark because the problem with having a central newel is that you can't get light very well into it, so it's incredibly awkward, and it means that the turning, as you're going up or down, I mean, you've all been up, you know, campanili and you know, into the top of churches, you know, and you have these horrible spiral staircases that two people can't pass on. Well, you know, what on earth was going to happen with these? I mean, they're incredibly awkward and don't actually work. To illustrate just how important access to an illumination of a villa from the exterior of the ground or semi-basement floor was for Palladio, an excellent example by comparison is Villa Baduet Frate Polesine, designed in 1554 and already inhabited by 1556. Whether because of the presence of earlier ruins on the site or because the patron or architect had requested as few doors or windows to the ground floor be visible from the front, there are only 2 doorways set under the staircases leading from the main building to the curved barchesse that provide direct access to the ground floor, where, as Palladio pointed out, di sotto la cucina, le cantine e altri luoghi alle comodità pertinente. And we'll have a look at this in a minute. So this is the side. There are in fact 3 windows on this side. There's also an entrance into the basement from outside, which you can't see. The back has 6 windows illuminating well the basement, and even on the front where these 2 doors lead into access to the basement, there are also 2 further windows to illuminate the basement, so it's very well lit. So on closer expansion, there are plenty of windows that are set on access, and there are no less than, there are a total of 12 windows that illuminate the basement, making it one of the best lit of all of his villas. At Villa Saraceno, 1548 to 55, doorways set on both flanks of the building lead directly to the cellars. So you can see there and also there, as well as windows. And as Palladio says, di sotto vi sono le cantine. The same is true of the Villa Poiana, as you see here, 1549 to 63, in this case located on 2 sides and giving access to the kitchen and the cellars. So again, easy access, plenty of illumination. The ground floor rooms of the early Villa Gordi at Lonigo have direct access into the ground floor from either side of the central staircase. Another strategy of Palladio's was to have a central ground floor doorway set under a staircase. So this is the Villa Ragona at Gizzole in 1553, so you just go straight in underneath with windows on either side. And of course, the Malcontenta, 1560s, where direct access to the ground floor both at the front and the rear. So right through the middle, and you can see that here. When these doors are open, there's a perfect access going straight through the ground floor of the villa. And as Palladio says, yet again, e sotto vi sono cucine, tinelli e simili luoghi, e è fatto il volto, così di sopra come di sotto. So he's got a clear strategy for doing his basements, which is abandoned at the Rotonda. At the Villa Pisani at Lonigo, 1542, one of his earliest ones, doorways leading directly into the semi-basement floor appear in his plans, and they'll also be seen in a minute. So there, windows at the sides, and here, windows and doors leading directly into the basement. So again, easy access in and out. This is one of his earliest villas, and here he articulated clearly his program for villa design. Sotto vi sono le cucine, altri simili luoghi per la famiglia. Da un lato e l'altra parte del cortile vi sono le stalle, le cantine, i grinari e simili altri luoghi per l'uso della villa. So it's all practical. Palladio's treatise is practical. And he's got great attention to how a villa will work properly. This one has 12 windows, 2 doors illuminating the ground floor and providing early access. Another design feature of most of Palladio's villas that is absent at the Rotonda is a well-lit and functioning staircase within the building. And here, of course, I'm showing you the spectacular staircase at the Convento della Carità in Venice that he'd already designed and built. So it's a beautiful style staircase that is top lit. So light comes all the way down, and it means it works very, very well. And he talks about, in his treatise, he talks about this with regard to the Villa Tiene, for example. He says, sono le scale senza muro nel mezzo e perché la sala per ricevere il lume di sopra è luminosissima, esse ancora hanno lume abbastanza e tanto più essendo vacue nel mezzo, ricevono il lume anche di sopra. So, given that he'd already designed this, it's very, very hard to understand why he opted for 4 small, narrow, badly lit spiral staircases for the Villa Rotonda. One of the main motivations possibly could have been that Palladio had drawn a similar type of staircase at no less than the Pantheon, these triangular staircases. He'd drawn them, there are drawings of him where he's measured them, and so it's a very, harking back to the ancients, so, this could have been the reason. He illustrated them in the Quattro Libri, and they also made use of the spaces generated by the central cylindrical form. So if you've got the cylindrical form and that's a mast, you've got 4 corner spaces, so why not fill them with 4 identical staircases? This is presumably the reason why he does it like that. But it's interesting that we all think the Villa Rotonda has perfect symmetry when it doesn't really at all. There are 2 very distinguishing features. Obviously, these corridors are wider and these are thinner. But also, if you look where the openings of the staircases are, they're not even on the diagonal. They are to the right and the left and to the left and to the right of the diagonal. So they would have come out into the central room in a slightly asymmetrical way. So it's a long way from an ode to symmetry if we look at it more carefully. So, the only other instance when Palladio uses such a staircase, these triangular ones, is at the Capra Palace in Vicenza, but there it's a service staircase next to a much bigger oval a lumaca staircase. To sum up, both sensible internal stairs and sufficient ground floor illumination are missing from Palladio's design and may have been a significant factor in what appears to be a stalling of construction in the 1570s. The client may or may not have come to a realization at this time that he did want a farm, and therefore the design of the complex would need to be altered. Palladio may or may not have been willing to alter his design, if indeed he had been requested to. Palladio was also very busy in Venice in this period. He'd finally hit the big time. He'd been striving with limited success to gain significant commissions in the capital since the early 50s. But in 1565, so probably the same year that he was commissioned to do this, he was also commissioned by the Benedictines to rebuild the complex of San Giorgio Maggiore. It's a hugely prestigious commission with basically unlimited funds, and it was a project that took up the rest of his life. So the way architects work, you can't be in 2 cantieri at once, and we know that lots of architects went around at the end of the day to various cantieri in Venice to check what their workmen had done. That was the only, so we know Longhena, for example, at the end of the day would go around to his various cantieri and do that, but you cannot do that in Venice and Vicenza on the same day. It's impossible. So compared to the Villa Rotonda, the Benedictines are a big, big, big prestigious project in the capital. So that could be a reason why things came to a halt. By 1577, he'd secured the commission for the Church of the Redentore, another enormously prestigious project for the state in Venice. It may well have been that soon after 1570, client and architect came to realize that they had different ideas about the villa complex, and so work came to a halt. Without documents or a new discovery, what transpired in the 1570s will probably remain unknown. Another potential factor, however, is that a younger architect, Vincenzo Scamozzi, born in 1548 in Vicenza and died in 1615, probably in Venice, had come onto the scene in Vicenza and at an astonishing early age, in 1576 had been commissioned to design a version of Palladio's project for Vettor Pisani on a hill outside Lonigo. The so-called Rocca Pisani. In many ways, the Rocca Pisani can be considered a very thoughtful correction of all the design deficiencies of Palladio's original. Presumably both Palladio and Almerico knew about it by the end of the 1570s. Palladio's death in 1580 left the original client without his architect, but also with the possibility of pursuing his villa project according to his own wishes and working with perhaps another architect. And I think you can see the sorts of changes between the differences and similarities. Scamozzi introduces entrances at the side of the staircase so that they're illuminated in here for a start, and he is less fussy about the symmetry. His staircases are much better lit, as you can see here. He does have a central newel, but he's got lots of windows, so they're fairly commodious, they're spaced. And this is all done while Palladio is still alive. That's the important thing. His staircases are wonderful and well lit and made of stone, so not of, rickety old wood. And his ground floor is beautifully illuminated. All these photographs were taken by Alessandro Camollo, to whom I'm very grateful, who took all the photos for my Longena book, and they're all taken with natural light, not with any illumination. You can see through the whole ground floor. It's beautiful and beautifully illuminated. And here you can see right through from one side to the other, and access is an absolute non-issue. You can see it there. It's an absolutely magnificent version of the Villa Rotonda with lots of so-called improvements. Did Capra turn to Scamozzi? It's a question. So I'll try and go to my third phase, which is what possibly happened from 1580 when Palladio died to 1589. And again, this is all based on this circumstantial evidence, it has to be said, because the documents only exist from 1591. But something must have happened, and I try and explain what happened. And this third phase is called a working farm set on a necropolis. More mysterious than an Alfred Hitchcock film, and with only circumstantial evidence to rely on, what might have happened in the crucial years after Palladio's death and before the original patron's death. The only way to make a plausible hypothesis about this period is to work back from the 18th century evidence of the building that tallies with the early 17th century accounts. So basically, what Courtyard says and what Jones says tallies with what Mutoni engraved and published in 1740. It's consistent. So presumably nothing much happened in that period. Both Courtyard and Jones describe the external stairs as being open in the middle. And Jones explains that he could see through the building at ground level, and that there were two internal wooden stairs and another two spiral lumaca stairs in stone. Given this mostly tallies with what Mutoni depicts in 1740, perhaps the best place to start is what he actually has to say, and I think Mutoni's been a very underrated source for what the state of the Villa Rotonda was. And we have to remember, Mutoni is very pro-Palladian. He's writing a book about him, so as a consequence, what he's going to say is impartial at best or worst, and he would be biased against any changes against Palladio. He held Palladio in great esteem. So what he says about this, he's not pro-Scamozzi, he's pro-Palladio. So let's see what he says, because I think it's very, very interesting. He identifies the site of the building just outside Vicenza. That's right, there it is. The name, as well as the patron, the architect. He explains that the building was begun under Palladio's direction, and he left a design in the Quattro Libri, all correct. He says the building is sited on a hill and surrounded by four public streets that go around the park in which the building sits. Now these presumably are this one, that one, this one here, and I believe originally there was you can see the planting, there was probably the 4th street was there. The park has 4 sides that are girded by walls. This is the park, as opposed to the larger, in which there are 3 entrance portals to the east, People don't like talking about these, but they're there. There's one on this side, there's one on that side, and there used to be one on this side. 3 entrance portals to the east, the west, and the north that lead to the building. He also says, because of Almerico's death, the fabric remained imperfect, was then owned by the Capra family, and presently belongs to Marcus Mario, who brought it to entire perfection in recent times. Then he says, and these are, so there's the door on this side. There is a door under this side. This is the woods facade, and you see the door. It's very hard to photograph, at risk of falling over. Okay. He then says, Palladio having died, direction to complete the work was given to Vincenzo Scamozzi, who ordered changes that are different from Palladio's design and which are here set out. Number 1. He made the cut in the 4 staircases in front of the porticos to give light, to give air and access to the ground floor for domestic service. 2, he isolated the 8 columns at the flanks of the 4 porticos, unlike in the design where they are joined to the walls. So here these 2 are joined to the walls, and here they're set out from it, and you can see that there's a gap between them. He did not build the dome of the room as in Palladio's design, thereby rendering it deformed. So he's happy to criticize Scamozzi, thereby rendering it deformed, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's certainly different. Some later English architects called it the apple pie dome. However, Scamozzi must be complimented for having erected the rustic service bar Casa in such a manner that it neither interrupts nor occupies the view and the beauty of the building. He frames the view, he doesn't obstruct it. He also built a large Caneva, well, it's under here, under part of the courtyard, supported on all sides by big Tera Pianet walls. In one part of these walls is a large cistern for domestic use and for watering the garden. Well, this stuff all exists still. It's just never reproduced in any book on Palladio, practically. That's the corner where they built the cistern. We even got to open it and take a photograph. The cistern is there, and the reason why it's in this corner is the water goes down into the fields from here and is very close to the building. Again, very practical. It's there, it's never reproduced in a book on Palladio except by accident. It's a working cistern even today. So it's for domestic use and for watering the garden. So except for the documents that prove the entrance gates in the park walls were still being constructed in the 1590s, Mutoni's description of work up until Palladio's death in 1570 and beyond tallies with what is known. The villa sits on a hill. Oh, and the other thing, sorry, I should have done this before. The cuts in the stairs. Mutoni says that they're by Scamozzi. Well, if we need more proof, this is from Scamozzi's treatise, and it's all about how to get extra light into your villa. And he explains that, that's what all these diagrams are for. You have an oculus like the Pantheon, and that will put light to there. You can get light all the way into there, and look, what's that one? That is light from the cut staircase. This is designed by Scamozzi. There's your cut staircase in the middle, and that means that light comes in and is much lighter under here. If there's any doubt about that Scamozzi is absolutely interested in good lighting, you can see that here also. This is his design for the Church of the Celestia of 1580 in Venice. You can see the similarities. The door and the window are practically the same, and it's all about light effects inside the building. He's very conscious of that. If a building is dark inside, it's not as easy to live in. And so that's what these drawings are about. But I think you can see that there is a correspondence between his treatise and what was built at the Villa Rotonda. And just to say whether, every time Scamozzi does something different than what Palladio designs, people say, oh, isn't he awful? He's so disrespectful of Palladio. But where do you think he got the precedent for split staircases? Well, in the Villa Barbaro, there are split staircases, and it enables you to see right through the Marchese from one side to the other under the villa. So we might actually say that Scamozzi's split staircases was actually rendering homage to Palladio and using a device used by Palladio to fix up the problem with Palladio's villa. So I think we have to forget this thing of Scamozzi always, hating Palladio and all of that. Actually, I think that may well be the precedent for how he comes up with a solution that respects Palladio. So rather than the other way round. Okay, the dome is different. This is true. He rendered it deformed. I would say many critics would judge Scamozzi's dome to be of superior design. And I think the reason why the different design, or at least one possibility, was that Capra lived off his benefices, but the new bishop of Vicenza, who came in 1569, decided to try and restrict benefices for anyone who didn't live where their benefices were from. And Capra was the worst offender because he had about 5 or 6 benefices, but he didn't live in any of them. He lived in his villa. And so he was in litigation with the Bishop of Vicenza all through the late 60s and early 70s. So in that case, there might be a jolly good reason why he didn't want an ecclesiastical dome on his villa, but rather something different. In fact, that's maybe why Scamozzi was very useful for him, and I'll come back to that, because Scamozzi essentially didn't like domes, whereas Palladio did. So, why would Scamozzi have made such changes? Were they prompted by Almerico? Were they suggested by Scamozzi? Were they a combination of the two? I believe Almerico changed his mind about what he wanted, and I think the most obvious thing was, given that we know that he acquired this land after in the late 1560s, is that he did want a working farm. That's why, otherwise, why buy more land? Well, some people say to preserve the view, and that's plausible, but also possibly because he did want to have a working farm after all. So, if he had a working farm, what do you need? Well, you need the Marchesa, and we know that that's what Scamozzi built. At least Muttoni says so. And if we're thinking about preserving the view, the other side is the only place you could build the Marchesa without ruining the view. Because if you have these beautiful open views on the main entrance and this side, and you've got woods on the other side, it doesn't leave you any other option about where to put a Marchesa except over the back. And I think that's exactly what Scamozzi did. I think it's his main contribution. And the second thing I think he did was that he changed it from a Belvedere to a Necropolis by building the podium. And this has almost never been talked about, this podium, but it's actually incredibly important. From here, you can't really see it. And there are a couple of reasons why I think he builds this podium. We've talked about one already, that he puts a cistern in this corner, so that's very practical, and because of the Marchesa on the other side. But there's a third reason, which is visual. By building the podium, you can't see that the stairs are cut through in the middle, because your view is blocked of the external staircase. We'll have a look at that. So I think that's what happens. It was originally on a rolling hill, and then Scamozzi decides to build the podium, which is what I think a lot of the work was being done in the 1580s. Now, this is something, technically it's a pretty radical change, especially if you're building up here already. And this is something I'd be very interested to have the opinion of everyone here. But that's clearly the original entrance, except it goes to a blank wall. Well, why is that? I'll show you in a minute. My slides are slightly out of order. Anyway, there's the original entrance. Why did he do a different dome? Well, there's the new dome. I think he didn't like domes. He avoids any sort of ecclesiastical dome here. On his later villa, he removes the dome entirely from the outside and makes a square box. He's not a fan of domes. You can see that he likes an internal dome, but he doesn't want a very visible one from outside. He doesn't have it's a Pantheon dome, it's not an ecclesiastical dome. In this drawing of San Nicola da Tolentini of 1590, he shows the interior of the dome but not the exterior. And look at the way he's cut the drawing here, how he's used the scale to actually not show the dome, which is very interesting. Oh. And the only time he draws a dome is on this project for Saltzburg Cathedral, because obviously it's a church. So he's not keen on domes. What he also does, therefore, let me try and sum up what I think he's done. I think Scamozzi designed the two spiral staircases. Gordon Higgett has just attributed one of them to Scamozzi, and one was rebuilt by Mutoni. But I think you can see there's looking down, and there's looking up that spiral staircase. There's the spiral staircase in Scamozzi's treatise, now attributed by Gordon Higgett to Scamozzi. So he changes the staircases because you have to have feasible staircases in a villa if you're going to live in it. And what could be better than a top illuminated spiral staircase rather than a dark wooden staircase such as Palladio had designed? He introduced to the Villa Rotonda, I would say, where Palladio only has a small window, he cuts through here to provide space and light, just as we see also on his own Rocca Pisani. I think you can attribute that to Palladio. It means that these corridors under the Villa Rotonda are more visibly lit, and you can see how much more access and light that provides to the lower floor. So this is what it looks like, one of them under one staircase, a bit of a storage area. Under another, it's a bit cleaner, but you can see how well lit they are. You can also see this wonderful construction, 1590s, by experienced bricklayers that you see here. And most astonishingly, so this is what it looks like if you go under there, very beautiful, into these illuminated spaces that you can see here. If you hold your camera up, you can more or less show them. They are well lit. They're a bit messy. But also, and this is something I'm not absolutely sure about, but introduced on two sides are these connections between the loggia itself and the area underneath that gives more light down into the loggia. To people, I've never seen those in a publication. They're pretty ugly, but there are four of them on one side and on the other. They put a lot more light down into the basement area. As you can see here, it all lines up, top windows up there, windows here, and then windows down here. You can see that the windows here would never be have so much light if this wasn't open. Dating of this, not sure, but if Martin Kubelik's thermoluminescent dating of the lodges is correct to 1590s, then these openings would also be possibly designed by Scamozzi and executed by stonemasons in the 1590s. Question mark. But certainly it means that the windows here get, you can see it's a correspondence of all the windows. It's pretty ugly up there. Now, the two lodges that have the openings, the grills, have more recent pavement. Don't know the date. The others, I think, probably have the original paving, as you can see here. So, the problem of seeing the rotunda is that no one sees it. You know, it's like no one enters Venice as a stranger. We know Venice before we get there. No one sees the rotunda because we've seen the illustration and we go there and we see what we want to see. But it's also because the owners have carefully prescribed how you can see the villa, especially by the use of foliage, of planting, to obscure visions of the Villa Rotunda that they don't want, and the change of entrance that frames the view. So I think that Palladio's building once sat on top of a hill from which the ground rolled away gently down on most sides, but probably not on the side of the Barchessa. The principal access was on the main road to the north towards Vicenza, on the raised Sentinel. After Palladio's death, I think it's plausible that Scamozzi was employed to help Almerico realize this new vision for a working farm. And I think that he as an architect, probably came up with designs which then were begun and were continued after 1591 with the Capras, given the similarity between the sort of cuts in the stairs and his illustrations in his treatise. I think it seems to me plausible that what they followed in the 1590s, even if Scamozzi was not involved in the cantiere, which I don't believe he was presumably designs furnished by him. Conclusion. Given the evidence, both documentary and circumstantial, and I'll just show you some more details, early entrance gates that have been blocked up, and here you really see the idea of the Acropolis more than ever, and that you can't see the podium from here, and how the stairs come down very abruptly, stopping down here, and again going out below. These huge walls, and again abruptly stopping. And there's the podium, which most people don't think about enough. So there's our entrance. So given the evidence, both documentary and circumstantial, presented above, what reasonable conclusions might be drawn? A maximalist position for Palladio would argue that he revised his design for the villa subsequent to its publication in 1570, and that these revised designs were followed thereafter, including the documented work of the 1590s. These revisions would include the dome, the pronaos, the accesses under the stairs, the tunnels leading down to the fields. A minimalist position for Palladio would argue that he designed the villa for Almerigo in 1567 and published it in 1570, by which time the patron's ideas about the project had fundamentally changed, essentially intending a working farm which would explain the further purchases of land and which might be explained as the patron ensuring his views from the villa be protected, a bit more about the working farm. Patron and architect went separate ways, or work simply stalled, we don't know. Possibly stalled for the legal issues. The quantity of work documented in the 1590s is enormous and indicates how much of the building was built after Palladio's death. I don't want to attribute everything to Scamozzi. A minimalist position for Scamozzi, who himself referred to work on the villa without specifying what, would see his contribution as the Barchessa, and possibly nothing more. Or would also include one or two spiral staircases, and nothing more. A maximalist position, on the other hand, would not only attribute to him the dome and the two spiral staircases, but also the change of entrance and the tunnels leading down to the fields and the cuts in the central into the external staircases. But even more importantly, I think the entire concept of the podium, the villa as being set on an acropolis. There's no evidence for this, but it's absolutely not in Palladio's image of the building. So, on the other hand, it would be possible to take a maximalist position regarding the operae, who documented the 1590s. No architect is. After the patron's plans changed, he altered the designs of the villa and surroundings, and he then got in local workmen and workmen from Venice and got them to do it. The problem with that is the quality of the building, I think. So I don't really believe it's a Scalpellino from Venice. Until new information comes to light, these ranges of possibility for various contributions remain open. But in terms of probability, I believe it would be fair and plausible to suggest that around the time of Palladio's publication, we find a change of aims, it doesn't go on, work halted, and it was in the 1580s, after Palladio's death, that Scamozzi was probably called in and provided these series of corrections as outlined above. Low dome, the podium, working farm without ruining the view from and of the Rotunda. This was continued in the 1590s. The cut stairs were built, as were the pedimental porticos, and these were documented by Mutoni. The reason why we don't have one on the side facing the road is during the Battle of 1848, in fact, the troops came and destroyed this side. So when it was rebuilt, they covered up the tunnel that you see below. So there are tunnels underneath, which are never seen in Palladio's design. There's the original entrance, and I'll just go through these. There's plenty of photos, but you've seen most of them now. And I think it was also Scamozzi that built this side of the podium. You can see how high it is, how substantial. Very big walls, and it means that the Barchessa frames the principal approach from the street and frames the view of it. And the reason why I believe all of this, I'm really working on Scamozzi, is that these are all the things that Scamozzi does with his Rocca Pisani. You don't approach it directly, you approach it on axis. As you see here, you come up and you go in a diagonal. And this is most clear in this. So when you come in, there is a path that you can walk up that's on axis, but for the carriages, it goes around like this. So you approach the thing on a different percorso. So he moves away from the axial view to a non-axial view. Scamozzi was very good at that, and that's exactly what he does by repositioning the entrance of the Villa Rotonda of Palladio, at least in my opinion. And wonderful visual effects such as this that Palladio didn't envisage. How much of it could be by Palladio? Well, I'm going to tell you just one appalling thing to finish off. In 1850, there was a radical restoration of the Villa Rotonda, and they rebuilt the stairs, all 4 exterior stairs, and because they checked the treatise against the actuality, they found that there were 19 stairs in reality, but only 18 in the treatise. So when it was rebuilt, they only put 18 stairs because that's how you palladify your building. That explains possibly this here. UNESCO World Heritage with a metal step at the bottom. So basically, this building has been Palladiofied practically since Palladio was dead. And so that's why it's so hard to get to the bottom of all of this. Now, this is for Federico. I didn't know he was coming, but it's true. Does it matter? No one thinks any less of Michelangelo because his dome was really redesigned and built by Giacomo della Porta, as Federico's excellent research has shown us. And it's important to get away from these big names and think about it. Does anyone really think less of Palladio because a considerable amount of his Villa Rotonda was actually designed probably by Scamozzi? I think the answer should be no. You know, forget the big names. This horrendous object, which it's documented, you know, may once have been a Leonardo, but this is before restoration in 1913. So it's been so repainted and repainted and repainted. There's nothing of Leonardo there. When I was at the Courtyard, a girl went to ask Jill Dunkerton, the restoration lady at the National Gallery. She wanted to do a PhD on Gentile Bellini's image of the Sultan. And Jill had to say, I'm sorry, you can't. That's 3% Gentile Bellini and 97% me. So, you know, I think the evidence, at least from the treatise, is when we look at Scamozzi, we can see a lot of elements in the built rotunda that would appear to be more his design than Palladio's. Does that matter? Well, I'm trying to write a book on Scamozzi, and I couldn't go any further until I'd sorted out for myself what I thought he'd done at the Villa Rotonda. Thank you.